Several days ago, Sargon of Akkad made a video called Open Borders Imperialists, and it was the worst video I have ever seen from Sargon of Akkad, who I normally like. With a title like Open Borders Imperialists, I have to ask, when did Sargon start huffing paint? This is the worst video I've ever seen from Sargon, not because I disagree with it, though I do rather strongly. It's because his arguments just don't hang together even if you agree with them. They contradict each other, they're inconsistent, they're easily proven as factually wrong. And nowhere is Sargon more factually wrong than his economic analysis. This is going to be the first video in a series because Sargon crammed so much nonsense into such a short video, but I originally recorded a very long reply video to Sargon of Akkad, debunking his economic talking points point by point, but I realized that wasn't a reply to Sargon of Akkad, that was just a 1-hour lecture about basic economics. Sargon's economics are so terrible and his economic analysis is so shallow, I really do have to ask, does Sargon actually know anything about actual economics, aside from the phrase supply and demand?
To anyone with an ounce of common sense, this might seem self-evident. The law of supply and demand will always determine value. An anti-immigration stance is one that naturally favours the worker, as it turns the labour market into a seller's market, benefiting those doing the work, rather than a buyer's market, benefiting those doing the hiring. What I'm constructing is, of course, an argument against the mass immigration of Antarctic farmers, for the protection of the wages of British farmers.
So that's his entire argument in a nutshell right there. And to start with, I'm going to note that this is broken windows fallacy writ large. Sargon is only looking at the seen benefits of his preferred policy while ignoring all the unseen costs. But some of these costs are easily seen if Sargon had just bothered to look or thought about it for 10 seconds. For instance, very basic question, where do wages come from? There's a very simple answer to this, but one which seems to elude Sargon. Wages come from businesses. Wages are a direct cost on businesses producing goods and services. If you make labor more expensive, you are making goods and services more expensive. This is going to have many ancillary effects, but that right there should tell you Sargon is wrong to want to restrict immigration to boost the wages of native workers. For starters, if you have a general increase in prices because making goods and services is now more expensive, that alone could wipe out any gains workers make in their wages. But secondly, not everyone in an economy is a worker. Not everyone produces labor. Not all workers are paid in wages, and not all wage-earning workers are in direct competition with immigrant labor. This is the concept of specialization and division of labor, basic Adam Smith level economics, which Sargon seems to be totally ignorant about. But then I said not everyone produces labor. Think about it. Who is most susceptible to a general rise in prices? People living on a fixed income. Pensioners, Sargon. Do you not care about them? If you make goods and services universally more expensive because you've artificially made labor more expensive, you're going to be screwing over old people. And if you say, well, we have a welfare state, they'll be taken care of, at that point you are taxing working people to pay the old people, to protect the old people from the policies you put in place to protect the working people, who are now being harmed by your taxes to pay the old people. This is why Frederick Bastiat said government is the great fiction where everyone attempts to live at the expense of everyone else. Fundamentally, Sargon doesn't seem to understand the difference between wages, standards of living, and purchasing power. He asks, why should you settle for declining wages? And the answer is because you don't want wages to rise, at least not necessarily. You want standards of living to rise. You want purchasing power to rise. Wages are only one half of the economic ledger. If the cost of goods and services is also rising, then rising wages don't do you any good. I think I've debunked Sargon's entire economic argument right then and there, but there's more, and I want to really emphasize just how wrong Sargon is about economics, how little he seems to have thought about what effects restricting immigration may have on one's economy. And if any of these arguments seem familiar, well, to quote the meme, immigration restrictions are just a minimum wage law with extra steps. So for instance, if you artificially boost the expense of labor, you are making labor-saving technology a worthwhile investment for businesses. If you are making human workers more expensive, you're making expensive technology competitive with human workers. You are also incentivizing businesses to outsource labor. After all, if you can't move cheap labor to the jobs, it will at least sometimes be possible to move the jobs to the cheap labor. And this gets to another point, which is why Sargon is fundamentally wrong. He loves to bang on about supply and demand, but he doesn't seem to have ever looked at an actual supply and demand chart in his life. If he had, he would know that supply and demand are not the only things on a supply and demand chart. Price and quantity are represented as well. When you increase the price of something, less of it is purchased. Wages for workers will only rise if there is a constant demand for labor, if it remains constant in the face of rising prices. But that is not at all a safe assumption. If there is a shift in the demand for labor, then you've not only had a net reduction in the number of people employed, the number of British people employed, but the wages that you want to rise aren't even going to rise enough to necessarily offset the cost of goods and services. You've in fact made everyone poorer off. And that is the fundamental flaw with Sargon's economics. He's trying to benefit a certain class of producer at the expense of consumers. And everyone in an economy is a consumer, but not everyone is a producer. And this directly contradicts something Sargon says later in his video.
I recognize the limits of the British state and believe its primary responsibility should be to protect the rights of the citizens over which it governs. Where possible, it should advance their interests with an eye to increasing their prosperity, but not at the expense of certain segments of the population for the benefit of others.
So, in addition to being incredibly naive about basic economics, Sargon has in fact contradicted his own stated principles about government policies only benefiting everyone, not benefiting some at the expense of others. If only Sargon had read some Frederick Bastiat, he would have known better. Now, I could end the video here because I think I've conclusively demonstrated that Sargon's economic understanding is incredibly simplistic and wrong, but I want to ask one more question. Just to drive home the point, is Sargon a fan of big corporations? I ask because what kind of company is best suited to take advantage or absorb an increase in the cost of labor? Would it be the small mom and pop shop on High Street? Would it be your local pub? No, it would be a large corporation, Sargon, which I know you don't like. Companies which have steady revenue streams, companies which have large pools of capital, companies which have easy access to credit markets and ways of minting new capital, companies which at the very least have the infrastructure and the overhead to either make do with fewer workers or liquidate the jobs in Britain and move them overseas to where they can access cheaper labor, which is yet another point that Sargon doesn't seem to think about. Not only are you increasing the prices of goods and services on the British domestic market for British consumers, you are also making British companies less competitive vis-a-vis their foreign competition. If a British business has to pay through the nose for British labor, it's going to be at a disadvantage against a foreign competitor who has access to cheap foreign labor. Sargon is just, his economic policies are a prescription for systematically driving small businesses out of business and for making British-owned companies disadvantaged against foreign-owned companies. As a nationalist, Sargon, how can you justify making your own economy weaker and less competitive on the global market? I would also ask Sargon, since he wants the government to create an artificial labor shortage, in what other economic sector is it a good thing to have a shortage of a commodity? And this is all before I say anything about the immigrants themselves. This is all bad news for British people, the British nation, the British economy. As a nationalist, Sargon, how can you justify making your economy smaller and less competitive How can you justify screwing over British pensioners and British consumers? And I've said nothing about the fact that immigrants in a country are not merely a supply of labor, they are also consumers. They demand goods and services. If you make your economy smaller by kicking out a huge number of consumers and depriving British businesses of customers, you are screwing over your own economy, Sargon. But this is all why a majority of people who study economics for a living, economists, are in agreement. Immigration is a good thing for an economy, and not merely those at the very top, but for everyone, including the very workers Sargon is trying to protect. For Sargon to say that the entire economics profession has gotten this one wrong, he is going to need to produce some very strong evidence backed up by rock-solid reasoning. Instead, he produces flimsy evidence, and his reasoning is so shallow and simplistic, it makes me question if Sargon knows anything about economics at all. So who would win? The entire economics profession dating back to Adam Smith, or one shit-posting Kekistani meme boy? The economics profession, hands down. As one final addendum, I want to make it very clear that I am not an expert in economics. I'm just a rank amateur. But if even a rank amateur like myself can spot the glaring errors that Sargon has made, the gaping holes in his logic, then I really have to conclude that Sargon doesn't actually know what he's talking about, and that his economic arguments against immigration are just crap. Which makes me then wonder, why has Sargon used such a horribly weak argument to justify his anti-immigration stance? Could it be he's looking for an argument, any argument, to lend some measure of credence to his otherwise unsupported or unreasonable position? Could it be he's looking for a fig leaf to cover up why he actually opposes immigration?
Like I said, I'm for no immigration. So, like any number above 1 is too much for me at this point.
Towards the end of his video, Sargon says that there are more than just economic arguments against immigration. Well, he had better produce those quickly because, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as economists are concerned, there are no economic arguments against immigration.